Thank you for joining us today. My name is Austin Sterling, and I'm with Pinion. And Pinion is the nation's leading food and ag business advisory firm. And we've got a variety of different ways we help farmers and ranchers in their business today. But today we're going to focus in on estate and succession planning. Today will be a video, or the first video in a series we'll be doing throughout the year, targeting different perspectives around the farm family table. Today we're going to be focusing in on the patriarch, the matriarch, the head of the family, and how you can plan for future generations on your operation. Today we've got two of the best we have with us, Lance Woodbury and Kevin Beerley. I'll let them introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their experiences in this field. Kevin, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, good morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. Again, Kevin Beerley. I've been with Pinion almost 30 years now, specializing in the succession and estate planning field. I got into this field because I have a passion for it. Our family farm is no longer in the family because my grandfather didn't really have a plan for our farm. His children didn't want to farm necessarily. And so the family farm disappeared in the late 70s, early 80s. And now me and my first 25 first cousins, we don't get together that much anymore because that was the place we all got together. So I do have a passion for trying to determine ways that we can keep the family farm in the family. And it's something that I believe there's an answer to, notwithstanding the fact that every family has different members and participants in the operations. But I do think there's an answer for every specific business model, and I'd love working with family farms to get the results that family wants.
Lance?
Great. I'm Lance Woodbury. I have also been with the firm quite a while. I took a little hiatus while I was at the firm for about 10 years or so to go do some writing and publishing, and but came back, and I have a background in conflict analysis and resolution, and also come from a farm family that saw some conflict. I sometimes joke with a background in conflict resolution that family businesses are job security for a mediator, because there's always lots of tension, disagreement, or conflict around how that farm might transition through generations, and working through those differences and getting everybody on the same page about what they want to have happen at a transition is my focus. So I often work with Kevin and others around the firm to help make sure that the communication among family members is good and that everybody is on the same page about what they want to see have happen for the future. Because Kevin, I know, as you well know, that as long as the family's in agreement about what they want to see happen, you can design an estate plan 6 ways to Sunday to make sure that happens.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you both. Well, let's dive right in here. So, Kevin, I'll start with you. You're an attorney and a CPA. So I would like your opinion. What is the current landscape of our estate tax system, and why does there seem to be some increased urgency here lately?
Yeah. Our current estate tax system and our long-term estate tax system is inconsistent and up in the air because every administration since the Nixon administration has changed the estate tax rules. Joe Biden is the first administration that has not changed those rules, notwithstanding the fact that they tried in 2021. But for the foreseeable future, the estate tax world will always be changing with the next administration. It has become a political football. A lot of the candidates running for office use that to either bait their base in or to create divides amongst different aspects of our voting bloc. And so even though we have a very liberal set of rules right now that allow for some really interesting and sophisticated estate planning, nobody knows what those rules will look like after the election in 2024 or the next administration after that. So I think that's what's really driving the interest this year is we have a very high exemption that is scheduled to sunset back to $5 million at the end of 2025. There's a lot of consternation about that. Land values have certainly increased recently with inflation. I think a lot of our audience probably are landlords, and they've seen an increase, and that should be a good thing. Creating net worth and wealth should be a positive thing. I don't want people worrying about the fact that they're either behind the exemption or over the exemption. And on top of that, we have states that have even lower exemptions where some of our listeners are going to reside. And so there's a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen with the exemption amounts through this next election cycle. And do we need a plan in place? Because I think people are remembering in the 2009, 9 and 10 timeframe, the rules were supposed to change drastically. And it was very hard to find an estate planning attorney, consultant to help people with those plans. And so people were trying to get out ahead of it, knowing there's only 20 months left until that time frame. And I think, Lance, you're probably seeing some of that also.
Absolutely. The availability of folks to help get the planning done that needs to be done, need to be lined up well ahead of the deadline.
Yeah, I wish there were more people like us, Lance. To be honest, Lance and I work together, and it is hard to find the right professionals. There's a lot of conflicting information out there, and ag has to be treated differently than your basically cookie cutter estate and succession plan. It takes someone like Lance leading that family through the process. Inevitably, mom and dad are going to start with the hardest question, and they can't answer it. And so there's no way to evolve into an estate and succession plan unless you have a process for it. And that's why I love working with Lance, is he has developed that process that allows us to answer some of the easier questions up front and then progress. And by the end, the hard questions kind of answer themselves. That's my experience, right. Lance.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That kind of a good lead into our next question, Lance. Finding the right professionals to help notwithstanding, what are some of the main reasons you see that a farmer would delay or avoid altogether the estate planning conversation?
Yeah, there's several reasons, and Kevin, chime in as I talk about these too, but the mortality question is probably often first and foremost in people's minds, that doing an estate plan does require you deal with your death at some level. And that's hard. That's hard emotionally. If you've been the key leader in a family business, if you've been the glue that has held the family together in many respects, having to think about what happens after you're gone is sometimes an emotional hurdle that people have to get over. Another reason people delay the conversation is maybe the next generation doesn't get along so well, and you're concerned about, if you make certain estate planning decisions, whether you will increase the level of conflict or consternation inside the family business. And it could just be there's some really difficult answers. So, for example, for the kids who didn't return to the farm, and the kids who did return to the farm, if you're going to be different about the assets that you give those two groups of people, having those conversations sometimes are not easy conversations to have, because our family hat sort of wants to treat people equally, but our business hat wants to treat people with some recognition of the contribution they've made to the growth of the farm and the growth in that asset base or net worth. And so the estate planning is the sort of intersection of family and business where they have to come together and make some decisions about that. And they're just not easy to make. And if it's not clear what you're going to do, sometimes it's easier to not have the conversation. Or one other thing that I sometimes see is people delude themselves into thinking that everybody will just get along and there won't be any problems when it's over. And that might be the case. But, when you start talking about millions of dollars going to different family members, and you work in-laws and grandkids and others into that conversation, the chances are that people are going to have different opinions about the estate plan and about who should get what and how that should look. And so that can sometimes, again, folks will delude themselves into thinking it's all going to be okay. And we don't need to have the conversations. They'll just like and respect whatever I do. And if they dig a little deeper, usually they know that's not the case. But sometimes it's easy to say that because of those other issues. They don't want to deal with their mortality, or they don't want to deal with a conflict or things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In my experience, once dad can get over that mortality question, and sometimes he can't, then he has the control issue of, I don't want to ever think about giving up control. And him and mom might not completely agree on how they distribute assets. Mom tends to want to treat everybody fairly, and dad's really thinking about that son or daughter or nephew or niece that came back and has really helped the farm progress and benefiting them even more. So, dad's been in such a survival mode, especially if you farm through the 80s. It's just about surviving. It's even hard for him to fathom that he even has this estate planning problem, and just tends to bury his head a little bit about this. And so a lot of times it takes mom, or more importantly, that whoever's coming back, to say, hey, dad, nephew, uncle, whatever it is, how do I know what's really going to happen when you and mom pass away or whatever? So I'm seeing a lot now, Lance, of the next generation really driving that conversation out of their insecurity a little bit.
Yeah. Which brings up an interesting point about it's a little bit awkward at times for the younger generation to drive that conversation, because they don't want to appear entitled to know. They recognize the parents own the assets and that it's their decision. Yet I often say to the parents, look, your decisions affect the livelihoods of your kids, particularly those that came back to the farm. So you sort of owe it to them at some level to give them some sense of certainty about what's going to happen in the future.
Absolutely. I usually say to the next generation, hey, if you're willing to pay for it, I'm sure dad will be willing to go through the planning process. So,
that's right.
But, these aren't small family businesses anymore, small family farms. These are businesses that are usually supporting maybe multiple families, if not employees also. And we're not in the survival mode anymore. Now we're in the thriving. How do we keep this together? So the thought process has to evolve with that. Yeah. And sometimes that can be a difficult conversation for dad to engage in a little bit.
That's right.
So I appreciate professionals like Lance that know how to actually get dad talking about that.
That's a good lead into my next question. With 30 years experience, Kevin, you've probably seen a lot of highs and a lot of lows with some of these families and their plans. And, it is tough to get the conversation going and get a plan in place. But, give some examples of what can happen of not having a thorough plan, not communicating your plan to your heirs, or just having no plan at all.
Yeah, when I first got into this business almost 30 years ago, I was spending all of my time in either mediation or the court process because mom or dad didn't have a plan. And now somebody either passed away or there's been a divorce, and we're scrambling to try to keep the family farm, the family business together. And at that point in time, it's almost impossible. When somebody starts bringing in attorneys, starts getting set as to what they think they deserve or entitled to, it is really hard to bring those relationships whole again. So I decided years ago, I have got to be proactive about this, because it hurt my heart to be in these meetings. It's not a pleasant way to spend an entire day, week, or month. So years ago, I started getting in front of as many ag seminars as I could, talking about there are opportunities to solve these problems. A bad plan isn't good, but no plan at all is the worst thing you can allow to happen. Because again, the kids are going to make up what they think mom and dad wanted based upon their actions, how they work throughout their life. The children will start to make up what they think is fair, equal, whatever you want to say. And then who they marry makes up even another narrative about what should happen once mom or dad passes away. So it is imperative that the senior generation has some kind of a plan, because if not, we're going to end up in a court proceeding. And judges don't understand this stuff. What they say is sell all the assets, pay your tax bill, pay your attorneys, and if there's anything left, split it amongst the kids evenly. And there's rarely anything left. And I'm seeing that more and more. I think we had a good run during the 2000s where I saw a lot of farms that were family farms that were doing some really good estate and succession planning. And I think we've gotten away from that a little bit. I think this high exemption that went into place under the Trump administration really allowed people to just kind of relax and not think about it, because it's hard to think about, as we talked about earlier.
And Kevin, when people have to pay that tax bill, what the courts don't understand, if they're not familiar with agriculture, is that will require often the sale of land to make that happen. So the equity that the family has built up over the years, one of these negative consequences is if you don't plan for it and it does go to the court system, or even if it doesn't go to the court system and you just have to pay the estate tax. And I'd like you to talk about what those rates are so people get a sense for that. But, that could end up creating the whole dissolution of the business just in order to pay tax.
And that is usually what happens, Lance, to be honest. Even if the family, after mom or dad have passed away, even if they can agree a large and substantial part of that land is going to have to be sold to pay the estate tax bill. And especially if you live in a state that has its own inheritance tax bill. So when I meet with dads and they don't want to go through this process, I say, let's go out and pick out the farms that your son and daughter is going to have to sell in order for them to continue to farm here, because they can't keep all of this, whether it's to pay the estate tax bill, to pay for probate if they really don't have a good plan that avoids that. Settlements, again, I see a lot of families that don't have buy-sells in place. So if you have to buy out a sibling or two, again, land has to be sold.
And so what in the estate tax arena, Kevin, what is that tax amount that you would have to pay? Take a $5 or $10 million farm. What are we going to have to pay in tax if we don't have an estate plan?
So under the current rules, each person has about 13.6 million. So that's what has alleviated the pressure to do some estate planning, is because, again, between a husband and a wife, you have almost, over $27 million of exemption. Again, that is set to go back to $5 million a person, and marrying more spouses doesn't get you out of that problem, right? In this country, you only get to have one spouse. So once you're over that exemption amount, the tax rate is the lowest it's ever been. It's 40%. But that's 40% you're working for the government and not for your family if you're over that exemption. Historically, for the first 100 years, that tax rate has been 55% or higher. And there's a lot of concern that it's going to go back to those higher tax rates. And if you live in a state, especially in the Midwest, that has its own inheritance tax, those exemption rates are a lot lower. $1, $2, $3, $4 million before you start paying a 15 to 20% tax rate. So it's imperative that you know which state you're in, whether it has an estate tax, and then where you fit within that federal system also.
So if those tax rates roll back and somebody say, and we know what land prices have done. So if you've got land that's worth, it might have been worth $1,000 or $2,000 an acre 10 or 20 years ago, but now we're talking $8,000 an acre, $12,000 an acre, $18,000 to $20,000 an acre. I mean, it doesn't take very many acres for you to be in a position where you're going to get hit with some estate tax if those exemptions roll back and you're going to have to sell ground. I mean, it just doesn't take as many acres as what we used to think.
Yeah. Here's my biggest concern is nobody knows what their land is worth today. When you're in an inflationary period, it's up to the IRS and their regulations. They get to define what your land is worth. And if you have development, wind, solar, any of those opportunities, mineral rights, the IRS under their regulations are allowed to value their land, your land. It's the highest and best use. And nobody knows what that is. So if you don't have a plan, the IRS has every right to audit your estate return and then argue with your children over what is the highest and best use. And there's nobody that could tell you what that is. So by having a plan, getting that land value appraised today and locking that in and disclosing that to the IRS, now you get that statute running so they can't argue with your kids about, hey, what's your land worth when you pass away?
You get to define the terms instead of letting the government define the terms. That's
absolutely.
Really cool.
Being proactive, get on the front end of it.
Yeah.
100%.
Great. Lance, start with you on this next one here. So you guys have listed out a lot of different factors, a lot of variables that they may not know, what the future holds with a lot of them. But what could a farmer consider? Let's say he's got a 5-10 year runway left before he's thinking about retiring. What do you think some considerations could be for that, what that next legacy could look like, that next generation?
Yeah, I'd like to sort of answer that by talking about something actually Kevin brought up earlier, and that is this idea that when you started the business, or maybe it was 20 or 30 years ago, maybe it was 100 years ago, but there was a survival stage in the business. And as you worked through that, in survival stage, a bad year or two could take you out. Like you're living sort of hand to mouth in that survival stage. And as you continue, things get more stable. Maybe some kids return. You can survive a down year or two. You start to build up some equity and net worth. And then almost all farms that are growing face this jump from a stable place in business to a more professional stage where they have to start thinking about other people doing the labor. You start thinking about key employees. That causes you to think about hiring practices. It causes you to think about evaluations and vacation policies and all kinds of things we would deem professional, but frankly feel a little bit bureaucratic. But it comes because you've had kids come back and you're trying to think about what the future is in terms of the business. And so you're growing and you're getting more professional. And then there comes a point where you even think about, well, should we, if nobody decides to come back, should we keep the business going? Because what a farm is able to do by gathering up acres and operating those acres, your family may be wise to keep that property and actually even keep managing that farm ground and have a non-family CEO in the business and have a dividend policy. And then you're starting to talk about a board of directors and things like that. So part of what someone needs to have in mind is, do they see the business continuing up this ladder? Because at each stage along this ladder, you've got generational transitions, you've got new skill sets and mindsets. You know, what got you here won't get you there, so to speak. And there's also all along that way a chance to say, do we want to keep going? And some families say, yeah, let's keep going on up to that professional and enduring stage of business. Other families say, look, if we don't have anybody coming back, let's not keep it together. Let's divide it up. But something Kevin said earlier is what I like to say is, in the absence of a good story, people make one up. Meaning family members sometimes think that, oh, we're going to climb this ladder like all farms do, or no, we're not. If nobody comes back, we're going to sell it. But that can lead to lots of, if you don't have those conversations, can lead to lots of confusion, can lead to lots of assumptions that generate some conflict. So one thing for you to keep in mind as you're considering estate planning is what's going to happen to the operating business, and do I want to climb this ladder? Because if you do climb the ladder, it can feel a bit like you're sort of trying to change the tire as the car's moving down the road, because you've got new generations coming in, you've got older generations exiting, and you've got the business growing and becoming more complex all at the same time. Does that make sense, Austin? That be thinking about where you're headed up this ladder.
Yes, definitely. That's a good visual. Thank you, Lance.
And Lance, don't you know, I mean, as I'm interviewing the next generation, again, Dad was just in survival mode, trying to make this work from day to day. Probably had the mindset, if I have a bad year, I'll just work harder next year. The next generation tends to want to surround themselves with more professionals. They want access to knowledge and information more. They don't want to work like Dad did. I mean, that's what I'm starting to experience is they, okay, Dad, whatever value he put on the farm, it could change daily. But now I'm dealing with a 10, 20, $30 million asset base. I can't afford to lose this. I need professionals or educated people around me to help make decisions. Are you starting to see some of that?
Yeah, that's right. And to your even point about Dad, they're starting to, women have often been overlooked in the farm family business for the contribution they can make to leadership. And so as this transition continues, as people can do things from more remote locations, as we climb the ladder of professionalism and start hiring people, I mean, one of the things that people often need to consider is, in that next generation group, what are all the skill sets represented, not just by those who are on the farm, but by those who maybe are off the farm, but you maybe could do the marketing or some of the risk management or FSA work or things like that for the farm. And they do want professionals around them to help them make some of those decisions. So absolutely, they're looking for more of that advice. They're looking for more of the perspective. And sometimes they're even thinking about, how do I set up an advisory board or a board of directors to help us make that transition?
I'm seeing more of that because I'm really excited about opportunities for farms over the next century. As we become more of a green country, green, earth, whatever you want to say. I mean, the opportunities that these farms are going to have to generate cash flow, not necessarily just associated with growing a crop, are transformative. And they don't have all the information, all the background, all the knowledge to be able to make those decisions. They're seeing opportunities that Dad and Grandpa couldn't have even imagined years ago.
Yeah, that's right. One other thing I'd like to address in here is that as people consider the future, sometimes it does make sense to think about the business a little differently. And what I mean by that is, if you hold the business together over generations, but you don't address the relationship component of people working in the business, and there's some conflict there. One of the things that can happen is you sometimes hold the business together, but have people not speaking to each other in the business or have very dysfunctional relationships. And so one of the things, Austin, for the senior generation to consider is what work do we need to do to make sure that people in the business have good relationships? Because if you hold the business together, but everybody hates everybody, what have you accomplished? I mean, that's not success. So if you're going to hold this business together and do things to avoid the estate tax and use capital efficiently and other things, you also need to make sure that you've put in the kinds of communication structures and expectations and guiding principles around the values and the things that are important in your family that help people have good relational connections down the road. Because you, Kevin and I have seen plenty of instances where they may have had the right estate plan to keep the business together, but people weren't getting along in the business, and that is what pulled the business apart. So these two things really go hand in hand.
Yeah, if you haven't heard that one of the goals of the family business isn't family harmony, you haven't talked to mom. So go talk to mom, because that is her biggest goal, I promise you.
Yeah.
And there's a way to certainly make that. I can't always promise a family is going to stay together, but if you don't have a plan and don't communicate it, I can almost guarantee you this family farm will not work.
That's right. That's right.
Family harmony is sometimes the biggest obstacle for a lot of them we run into, it seems like. So, Kevin, you touched on it a little bit earlier, in terms of global politics, rapidly rising land values, upcoming election. If you can predict what's going to happen, please let us know. But there seems to be a lot of unpredictable variables here when it comes to estate and succession plan, where we do talk to a lot of families where they kind of have that let's wait and see what happens approach. What do you recommend, in terms of an entity structure, some different strategies that does have some staying power that can withstand some of these ebbs and flows of the political environment we're in today?
Yeah, certainly what life has taught us, and certainly during COVID taught us even more, is there's no guarantee of any lifespan for any of us, obviously. And so saying that I'm only 40 years old, or I'm only 50, or I'm only 60, it's just your way of not wanting to deal with the reality that any of us could pass at any time. So again, you're responsible for a business. You're responsible for at least your family, if not others, probably some key employees, and you have an opportunity to create a legacy. That should be enough drive to want to have you at least develop some type of an estate plan. And that starts with having a will if you have minority children still. And if not, then you need to have at least a revocable trust. So you get down in writing what you want to happen between whatever offspring and or inheritors you're going to have. And you need to lay out exactly what you want to happen. And in a farming operation, if you want to make sure your family members never talk to each other again, give an equal amount to every single child. Because now the on-farm heirs and the off-farm heirs are going to have to fight over that $1 million combine. And if the off-farm heir hasn't been on vacation in 2 years, that combine's not getting bought. So you have to separate the operations from the land, the legacy side. Those have to be separated. I can't think of a single farming situation where that isn't true. So in every farming environment, separating from the operations, from the legacy, the land portion, will help you in 90% of the situations, at least alleviate some of that family stress that could come once you pass away. And then making sure that each of those entities has really good buy-sells in place, because eventually somebody's going to want out of the family farm or the legacy side even. And if you don't have a buy-sell in place that sets the rules for how a family member gets out, a judge is going to have to decide that. And once the judge makes a decision, I'm sorry, Lance, go ahead.
Go, Kevin, just to clarify for the folks listening, when you say buy-sells, what you're talking about is a couple of paragraphs inside of the operating agreement of the limited liability company or partnership or whatever the entity. There's actually some legal language in there that spells out if somebody wants to get out of the business, get out of the partnership, this is how they do it. And you're sort of taking care of that before anyone needs it. So you're getting that addressed before emotions are running high, before you know who needs out or who wants in or who wants to go do something else with their capital. And you're trying to set all that up so that it's not a point of contention down the road. That's kind of the buy-sell conversation, right?
Absolutely. It's just a formalization of how somebody would get out of the business and still leave the business intact.
Very
so
good.
those decisions need to be made now, because dad knows usually best, dad and mom, of what kind of a buyout provision will allow the operational side to finance the buying out. So we don't have to sell land. So we don't have to go mortgage land. So usually we put something in place, work with dad and mom to put something in place that allows someone to be bought out over time at usually a discount. Mom and dad would like you to stay in the family business. If you want out, you're going to take a little discount and you're going to get bought out over time so the operations can finance it. That way it doesn't hurt the person that came back to farm on the family farm. So again, if those aren't put in place, and they're open to being changed. Again, they're not set in stone. We have to keep this very flexible. And that's the key to a lot of this. Build this in stages with a lot of flexibility, because there are a lot of young people that still need to have an estate and succession plan, but they don't know if they're going to have children coming back. They don't know if there'll be grandchildren coming back. So very flexible plans that puts the rules in place so that somebody isn't running to the courthouse, because that's the only way they know how to get out. There's nothing worse than owning a legacy entity that has substantial net worth, but they're not receiving any kind of income or dividend or financial cash flow from that, because then really all they have is a liability with no way of getting out of it. And so a judge will eventually rule, sell everything, pay the tax, pay the attorneys, and split up what's left. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Because at that point in time, we go back to what Lance said earlier, nobody's talking to each other again. Nobody's sitting down and having Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas dinner once you start involving attorneys and judges.
Well, great. That's been a lot of good advice. We've covered a lot of topics today, guys. In closing here, let's say you have nothing in place. You hear a lot of different options of other people doing certain things with their succession plans. What's a general first basic step to working towards a succession plan? Maybe a thought process, a question you can ask. What do you give someone advice to get this conversation started? Even if it's something simple.
One of the places I start is, Austin, by asking them to identify their guiding principles. And by guiding principles, what I mean there is, what do they believe about their family and their wealth that they'd like to see continue into the future? For example, I want the farm to stay together, and those that came back to the farm continue to operate it and have the opportunity to buy, should the others that didn't come back want to sell. Those that did come back have the opportunity to buy, because that leads to the buy-sell agreement Kevin was talking about. Or if they believe that, and even kind of digging into the operational side a little bit, do they believe that anybody who wants to come back to the family farm can do that? Or do they have to go spend a couple of years working somewhere else? Or do they have to go get a college or a trade school degree or something that gives them some skills to come back to the farm? Like, what are the things that if you just step back and kind of scrape away all the accounting and legal jargon and just say, hey, what's important about this base of assets? What's important to me? Is it important that it stays together? Or should each family member get a piece of land? I mean, for the person who's operating the farm, obviously it's easier to operate if that land is held together. But sometimes parents say, hey, we want to make sure there is a piece of land that each person gets, because that'll influence then how Kevin works on the strategy to make that happen without getting into a bunch of tax liability. So I kind of start from a standpoint of just think about your assets, think about your family, and think about the principles, the values that have guided you over the years, and jot those down on a piece of paper. I think that's helpful, because then if you take those values to your accountant and attorney, and by the way, the accountant needs to be an integral part of that conversation, if not a leading part, because so much of this revolves around the tax implications of things. But if you can take those guiding principles to your professionals so they can understand what's important to you and what your goals are, that's usually where I start. People sometimes, and Kevin has seen this, people get caught up in the tools. Should I use a intentionally defective irrevocable trust, or should I use a revocable trust, or should I just need a will, or do I need life insurance? They get sort of hung up in what are all the tools I need? And I say, hey, time out. Let's go back to what are your goals? What's important to you? What are your values? What are your principles? Because again, we can design lots of plans, but we got to know what's important to you first. Kevin, how about you? Where do you have?
Yeah, I'd echo that. And Lance is a published author and wrote quite extensively on this. So I would get Lance's book. I was able to read it in 2 days. So it's not.
I intended it to be read in an hour, Kevin. That it took you 2 days is a little concerning.
Even for a slow reader like me, yeah. But it has a lot of information, a wealth of knowledge in it. So get educated. I mean, I don't recommend going on the internet. You can go on the internet for a lot of things. You'll get lost in the weeds around estate and succession planning. I speak at 15 to 20 seminars a year. I would certainly recommend you go hear someone speak on estate and succession planning using the tax code to solve the problem, the tax problem. The softer side, you need someone like a Lance Woodbury. Luckily, our firm incorporates all of that. We incorporate, because what Lance said is correct, the accountants, the attorneys, and the consultants all need to be working hand in glove and know what each other are doing, because all you care about is the result. It has to have the right result for the family, which is based upon the family's specific goals. What I always say is wealthy families do not pay estate tax in this country. Too many loopholes. It's only uneducated people that pay estate tax in this country. Go get educated, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Kevin. A lot of great information today, guys. We really are just scratching the surface on the conversation, though. So if you heard something today that struck a nerve or you want to talk more with Kevin and Lance, please reach out to our firm. We're happy to talk. This will just be the first video in a series we'll have throughout the summer, targeting those different perspectives around the farm family table. But we're here to help. Please reach out. We appreciate the time today, and hopefully you learned something. Thanks for joining us.